Hi guys, we are Module 4, Group C, Natalie, Carla, Anna Kay, Elzair, and Jeremiah, and we're going to be talking about Havana, Cuba today. For context, the national economy was singularly based on the exportation of sugar. We're going to be talking a lot about the changes from before and during Fidel Castro's time in power, especially how the Cuban government changed from a capitalist to a socialist economy. And finally, we're going to be talking about how there's been insufficient housing in Cuba. Before Castro's rule, 66,000 of the 793,000 total urban housing units in Cuba were labeled uninhabitable and were therefore not public. There was not housing policy to make housing more affordable or available. In the beginning of Castro's rule, there was increased rural employment opportunities and social services so that the government could eliminate shanty towns. Some examples of this are they eliminated evictions, they reduced rent, and they created micro brigades, which were groups of workers released from their jobs to work on housing construction. The Urban Reform Law is an example of one of these new public housing programs, which established housing as a public service rather than a means of production or investment. Although these were all good forms of economic development and make Cuba seem idealistic, many challenges were associated with this new form of government. For example, Castro didn't have a planned system to keep up with all of the development programs, so this completely destroyed the capitalist economy and Cuba's financial reserves, and thus urban housing was neglected in the early 70s. Housing changed from single-family homes to four-story apartments as it was built. The housing was built so quickly and cheaply and was thus poorly maintained and defected, especially with the micro brigades that I mentioned earlier. And finally, to talk about the cause and effect of housing, to sum it up, because of the importance of sugar production to the success of the Cuban economy, rural areas see little to no employment opportunities except for working on the sugar fields. There are also below average living conditions, which in turn provokes rural residents to migrate to urban areas. Between 1953 and 1970, Havana saw a population growth rate of about 2.2% each year. This rural to urban migration led to the emergence of shanty towns, and during his rule, Castro focused on redistributive measures in the shanty towns of Havana. He wanted to eliminate these slums and replace them with new developments.
Well, looking at the present struggles, Havana struggled due to the barrage of tropical storms and lack of maintenance to upkeep current homes. In the year of 2008, Cuba had experienced an estimated 10 billion in damages by Hurricane Faye in a quick succession of two more storms. In result, these storms deteriorated buildings and city infrastructure with flooding and salt spray that leaves very little time for recovery. This pushes Havana deeper into the problem of inadequate housing that they have been unable to escape since the end of the Cold War. In 1989, Cuba lost its trade routes with Europe, meaning factories dedicated to production of prefabricated housing components closed due to shortages in fuel and materials. The number of housing units fell from 29,000 in 1988 to 21,000 in 1992. Soon after, the NGO Habitat Cuba was formed in 1993. Its role was generating alternative models to foster housing solutions, creating demonstration housing projects, and providing training to architects and engineers, and promoting citizen participation in solving housing issues. With that, Habitat Cuba had also worked to provide local factories for production of bricks and promote use of natural materials such as bamboo. Today, Havana is still struggling with its growing housing population, with 7% is declared uninhabitable and still in need of 300,000 more properties. Other driving factors can include the continuing reports of collapsing buildings, growing evidence of defective construction, resilient and expansion of urban congested housing, establishment of temporary shelters for natural disasters, and reappearance of slum housing.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about rural to urban migration and compare and contrast how this was affected before the communist regime and after, and connect this to the economy. So when the communist regime took over Cuba in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Havana was flourishing as a city, and it had a thriving economy and was the epicenter of economic growth for Cuba. And this was mainly due to the amount of revenue that tourism contributed to Cuba's GDP, and also as it was the epicenter of trade, as it has the main trading ports. So because of this, Havana brought in many workers that would commute from around Cuba to work, as well as a high amount of people migrating from rural areas. And Havana has always contained the highest amount of the urban population in Cuba. So as you can see from the tables, starting at the bottom in 1950, the population growth decreased as Havana became less of an economic epicenter as it once was before the communist regime. And although the growth rate was decreasing from the rate it was at before the regime took over, the population continued to increase as the government implemented many policies that urged people to move from rural areas to the city of Havana. And to compare the level of urbanization, Cuba was at a 69% urban population, and in 2019, it was at a 77 urban population, with about 24% of that being in the city of Havana. So you can see that although it was decreasing at a very slow rate, it was still overall increasing the population. And this goes to show that if the regime wouldn't have taken over Havana, it would have urbanized at a higher rate than it was at today. Oh, can I go to the next slide, please? So now I'm going to cover some of the main reasons why people will migrate to Havana and some of the negative effects that this has had on the city and how the government plays into these factors. So first off, Cuba's government is an extractive institution, which means that the government leaders offer little opportunities for their citizens to grow economically, and they direct the majority of the wealth for themselves. So due to this, there are less economic opportunities in Havana than there once was. However, the city is still very promising for people to find work and build a better life for themselves. So there's still a lot of people coming to Havana to work. And as of recently, tourism in Havana has become big again, and it has become a big contributor to Cuba's GDP and employs a large amount of the population. And it also contains the most universities and the higher ranked ones on the island. So this also prompts a large amount of migration to Havana. And some negative effects that this has had is there is stagnant economic growth for citizens, as there's a shortage of jobs because, for one, the government doesn't offer enough, and there are also too many people who are coming to the city to work. And there also is a scarcity of goods for basic needs to survive and to also work, such as food, cars, and gas. And that's what you can kind of see in the picture there. There's a lot of people, there's too many people in the city, but just not enough resources, like people waiting in line to get gas. And to connect this with the housing section that Anna was discussing earlier, an increase in rural migration has led to a scarcity in housing and infrastructure, as there isn't enough adequate affordable housing for citizens, which leads people to live in unaffordable and unfavorable conditions or resort to multifamily housing.
When you're discussing employment with Havana, Cuba, a major factor to take into consideration is that employment is dominated within the tourism industry. In recent years, the gears have been shifted to make a really dominant piece into their economy and people's source of income. Employment in Cuba has been changed a lot because now anyone, no matter what degree, would rather be working in the service industry with tourism because of the tips they make, rather working the occupation that they studied for. In places that tourism comes most of the capital, Havana, tourists are able to find their waiters and taxi drivers as former engineers, doctors, and attorneys. Consequently, it created a huge brain drain for people in their careers to leave their jobs and pursue jobs. The restaurant tourism industry, tourists bring in tips that add on to low wage service jobs that don't really pay that well. 2014, Obama repealed the embargo, which further helped build more economic strength of Cuban people. People were liberated. They want to invest more in small businesses, like around the industry, like hostels, taxis, and restaurants. But then in 2018, Trump targeted the tourism industry, which kind of helped result in a 20% drop in jobs. Trump's policies targeted the government, but ended up hurting the Cuban citizens, but rather than the government itself. Next slide, please. So back to now, they were kind of talking about the movement from the rural to urban cities like Havana have caused a lot of jobs that were initially no skills needing low wage to become to higher demand because people wanted jobs that have room for tips and tourists. Jobs like housekeepers, waiters, cooks, bartenders are all seen as coveted because of the time people who come in and want them to pursue, instead of pursuing their own career. This uptick of people residing in Havana to pursue their tourist-centered job leaves sometimes more than enough people working than them, which also leads to higher operation costs of companies.
So in conclusion, I will be going over the healthcare in Havana, Cuba. And we will see a connection between the healthcare and the physician care that the citizens of Cuba get, and how they contribute and are connected to the diplomacy and the political assets of Cuba. It was started in 2005 by Fidel Castro, and it specializes in a rapid response for natural disasters and outbreaks. I will later speak about how these result in a conclusion for these citizens, and it has helped 3.5 million people in about 21 countries. This is deeply rooted after the Cuban Revolution, and ever since, free healthcare and education were finally identified as universal human rights. But even though this does occur, this is a response to their diplomacy acts. So it is connected to their economy. Essentially, doctors are sent over, and 3,000 doctors were sent to Venezuela and other countries. And in return, Cuba profited from over $11 billion in a year. Next slide, please. Continuing on, even though doctors are very provident in Cuba, actually having the most doctors world around, there is a significant downside to this, because doctors are still paid the same average wage as a normal person or a normal civilian. And as a fact of this, there comes many controversies, even though the aid that Cuban physicians have given to the country, not as well as themselves, but outside, has definitely benefited many people. But Cuban government still takes about almost 90% cut average of their salaries due to this fact. And there's very bad treatment in these situations, since it is very harsh living conditions and working conditions for these physicians. And as a result, even Cubans and US officials have stated this as human trafficking for doctors. And even throughout the coronavirus, we still see aid from these physicians from Cuba. And as they're so prevalent and helpful, they're still community-based and focused on the essential needs of their community.